The diesel engine sighed into silence as Maya Devereaux eased her rig into the gravel lot of the Crossroads Travel Plaza, just off Interstate 80, 40 miles outside Ogallala, Nebraska. 2:11 in the morning, the kind of hour where the world narrows down to taillights and static on the radio, where every truck stop in America starts to look like every other one, same blue sign glowing against the dark, same rows of idling rigs breathing exhaust into the cold, same tired hum of vending machines nobody's buying from at this hour. She backed the trailer into the third spot from the fuel island, exactly where the surveillance plan called for. Position mattered, sight lines mattered. The hidden relay welded into the trailer's undercarriage needed a clean signal path to the comms van parked 2 exits down, and 3 months of route mapping had confirmed this was the spot down to the angle of approach. Nobody glancing at her rig would see anything but another long-haul hauler easing into a well-earned rest. That was the whole design, built brick by brick over almost a year. Maya Carter, independent owner-operator, 26 months on the road, clean record, boring as a Tuesday afternoon. Nobody looks twice at boring. Nobody was supposed to. She killed the engine and sat for a moment with her hands still on the wheel, feeling the quiet settle into the cab like dust after a long drive. 11 months. 11 months since she'd walked out of the Omaha field office for what was supposed to be a 90-day operation and instead become the longest deep cover assignment of her career. 11 months of sleeping in a cab that smelled like someone else's life, of memorizing a biography that wasn't hers, a childhood in Tulsa that never happened, a brother named Marcus who didn't exist, a divorce that had never needed to be finalized because the marriage had never been real to begin with. 11 months of learning to flinch at the right moments and stay silent at the right ones, of carrying a badge sewn into the lining of a duffel bag instead of clipped to her belt where it belonged, where it had belonged since the day she graduated Quantico, with her mother crying in the 3rd row. Tonight was supposed to be the payoff. Somewhere within the next 6 hours, the man they'd been chasing across 4 states, the logistics coordinator who moved fentanyl-laced freight through legitimate trucking networks like a magician palming a card, who had built an entire shell of legitimate paperwork around a pipeline that had already killed at least 11 people in 3 states, that the task force could confirm, and likely dozens more they couldn't, was supposed to make contact at this exact rest stop at this exact fuel island, believing he was meeting an independent hauler willing to look the other way for the right price. Everything had been built toward this single exchange. The fake manifests painstakingly cross-referenced against real shipping schedules, so they'd survive a database check from anyone curious enough to run one. The burner relationships cultivated patiently over months, with men who would kill her without a flicker of hesitation if they ever learned her real name. The 2 agents working parallel routes through Missouri and Iowa. Agent Reyes posing as a freight broker out of Kansas City, Agent Okafor embedded 3 layers deep inside a warehouse operation outside Davenport, neither of whom had any idea that her cover, and therefore theirs, now depended entirely on the next 6 hours unfolding exactly according to plan. If anything went wrong tonight, anything at all, it wouldn't just cost her the case. It would cost 3 other agents their cover, possibly their lives, and it would hand the pipeline straight back to men who had already proven repeatedly and without remorse that they didn't care who got hurt moving their product through quiet American towns that never saw it coming until it was sitting in someone's medicine cabinet. She breathed out slowly, watching it fog faintly against the windshield, and reminded herself of the thing her training officer had told her on her very first undercover assignment. 11 years and what felt like a different lifetime ago, the job isn't staying calm. The job is looking calm while you're not. Outside the Crossroads Travel Plaza held the particular stillness of a place that never fully slept and never fully woke either. Floodlights buzzed atop tall steel poles, casting long cones of white over rows of sleeper cabs, their windows dark, their drivers catching whatever rest the road allowed before the next leg of whatever delivery clock governed their lives. A scatter of headlights drifted along the interstate, beyond the tree line, distant and constant. The sound of the highway, a low, continuous exhale that never quite stopped the way. A heartbeat never quite stops until it does. The diner attached to the main building glowed amber through its windows, half empty at this hour. A waitress refilling a coffee pot for a trucker hunched over a newspaper he wasn't really reading, just holding the way people hold things at 2 a.m. to give their hands something to do besides shake. Near the fuel pumps, a young couple argued quietly beside their sedan, voices too low to carry their gestures sharp and tired, in equal measure the particular exhaustion of people who'd been driving since a different time zone. A maintenance worker pushed a cart of cleaning supplies toward the restrooms, one wheel squeaking rhythmically against the concrete with each rotation an unintentional metronome for the whole tired scene. Somewhere a dog barked twice, then stopped, swallowed back into the general hush. The air smelled like diesel fuel and fryer grease and the particular mineral cold of a Nebraska night in late autumn, the kind of cold that got into your knuckles before you noticed it had arrived at all. Everything about the scene said ordinary, said nothing happening here, said move along nothing to see the universal unspoken language of every truck stop in the country at this hour of the night. Maya had learned over 11 months and a career stretching back further than that to read places like this the way other people read faces, not for what was wrong, but for what was almost imperceptibly off the half-degree deviation from baseline that experience teaches you to notice before your conscious mind even catches up to the feeling. Tonight, scanning the lot through her side mirror while she gathered her thermos and her paperwork, she noted 3 patrol vehicles entering the lot within the same 2-minute window, parking with a deliberateness that had nothing to do with routine traffic enforcement and everything to do with intention. Before she'd even reached for the door handle, her mind ran briefly and automatically through the contingency protocols she'd reviewed 100 times over the past week with her handler back in Omaha. If local police made contact, comply, fully reveal, nothing, signal backup, only if physical safety or trailer integrity became immediately compromised. The protocol had sounded clean and manageable on paper, sitting across a conference table from 2 supervisors who would not be the ones standing in a gravel lot at 2 a.m. if it ever actually had to be executed. It sounded different now, with real headlights and a real badge clipped to a real stranger's belt, closing the actual distance between protocol and consequence. She thought, too, of the brief call she'd made to her handler 4 hours earlier, parked at a way station outside Lincoln, the burner phone pressed to her ear while she watched the dashboard clock count down toward tonight's scheduled contact. Stay sharp tonight, her handler had said the words ordinary on their surface, but carrying underneath the particular weight of a sentence meant to mean more than it said. We're close, closer than we've been in 11 months. Don't let anything spook this in the final stretch. She hadn't told him about the strange feeling she'd had pulling off the interstate an hour later, a feeling she couldn't fully articulate even to herself. Something about the way a sedan had held position behind her for 11 miles before exiting 2 miles short of the rest stop. Coincidence, probably. She'd learned over 11 months not to fully trust the word probably. There had been a moment 6 months into the assignment, parked outside a different truck stop in a different state, when Maya had genuinely considered whether the cumulative weight of pretending might eventually become heavier than whatever the operation was worth. She remembered calling her handler that night, too, voice flat with exhaustion, asking how much longer, realistically, this could run before something gave. He'd told her the truth, which she'd appreciated even as she resented it, however long it takes. There's no clock on this except the one the pipeline sets, and they don't know we're watching, so we let them set it. She'd hung up and sat in the dark for a long time afterward, recalibrating the way she always eventually recalibrated, finding the particular kind of resolve that came less from confidence and more from simple refusal to let 11 months of sacrifice end in anything less than completion. She reached for her thermos more out of habit than thirst, and that was when she saw them crossing the gravel toward her cab. 2 officers. The taller one walked with the loose, settled confidence of a man who had never once in his career doubted the outcome of an encounter before it began, the kind of walk that came from a decade of nobody ever successfully telling him no. His partner, younger, moved a half step behind him, flashlight already drawn, though there was nothing yet in the scene that required it. The posture of a rookie still calibrating which of his training officer's habits were worth keeping and which weren't. Maya rolled down her window before they reached it because that was the kind of small detail that mattered in moments like this. Compliance before confrontation, hands visible on the wheel, voice even pitched just slightly higher than her natural register, the small vocal adjustment she'd practiced for months until it no longer felt like acting at all. Evening officers. License and registration. The taller one's badge caught the floodlight as he leaned toward the window. Hutchins, the nameplate read. The metal slightly tarnished at one corner from years of use. His eyes did a slow pass over her face. Her hands, the interior of the cab in that order, cataloging her the unhurried way. A man catalogs something he believes he already understands completely before he's even asked a single real question. We've had some reports tonight. Trucks matching a certain profile coming through this corridor. Maya handed her documents through the window, the laminate cold against her fingertips, and felt the night settle around the exchange in layers, the metallic tang of the door's chrome trim cooling under her palm where she'd rested it a moment too long, the diesel and gravel smell rising thick off the lot with each passing truck, idling past on its way to the pumps, the distant clatter of someone dropping a wrench 2 rows over, followed by a muffled curse carried on the wind. The radio clipped to Hutchins's shoulder, crackling low and unintelligible, a fragment of dispatch chatter dissolving into static before it ever resolved into actual words. Small things, the kind of sensory details that meant nothing on their own, and everything stitched together because they were the precise texture of a moment she might need to recall with total accuracy later in a deposition, in an incident report, in a federal courtroom under oath, with the defense attorney trying to pick apart every second of it. She had trained herself years ago in a windowless room at Quantico that smelled permanently of stale coffee and dry erase marker to notice everything and react to nothing. Profile, she repeated, keeping her tone curious rather than defensive. The exact tone of a woman with nothing to hide and only mild irritation at being delayed on a long night. What profile is that exactly? Hutchins didn't answer right away. He studied her license under the beam of his own flashlight, now flipped it over, though there was nothing printed on the back, and handed it off to his partner without breaking eye contact with Maya, even once. Beck, run this. Beck took the license and retreated toward the cruiser, his flashlight beam bobbing unevenly across the gravel as he walked the radio at his hip, squawking something neither of them acknowledged. While Beck ran the plates, Hutchins drifted toward the rear of the trailer, crouching slightly to inspect the undercarriage with his flashlight, the beam sweeping along the axles and the long steel frame with a thoroughness that unsettled Maya more than anything he'd said so far. She kept her expression neutral, watching him in the side mirror, calculating the distance between the relay's housing and the angle of his light, running the math, automatically the way she'd run it 100 times in training scenarios that had never felt quite this immediate. The relay was built into a recessed panel designed to mimic standard trailer hardware, indistinguishable to anyone without specific knowledge of where to look. Hutchins didn't have that knowledge. He straightened up after a moment, apparently finding nothing remarkable, and resumed his unhurried circuit back toward the driver's window, oblivious to how close his flashlight beam had actually come to the one detail that could have ended everything in a single unlucky glance. Mind telling me why your routes changed twice in the last week? Hutchins asked, and something in the specificity of the question made the back of Maya's neck go cold beneath her collar. That wasn't public information. That wasn't something a routine traffic stop would surface in the first 90 seconds of an encounter, not without someone having looked at something they shouldn't have had reason to look at. Someone had been watching her manifest, or someone had told him precisely where and how to look, and neither possibility sat comfortably in her chest as the seconds stretched on. She kept her face carefully still, schooled into the mild puzzlement of someone being asked an oddly specific question about an entirely unremarkable fact of her job. Weather rerouting outside Lincoln. Dispatch moved me twice this month already. Happens more than you'd think this time of year with the early storms. Funny, Hutchins said, resting one hand on his belt. Unhurried, performing the unhurriedness for whatever small audience the lot might be quietly assembling around them. We've been tracking some patterns through this stretch of I-80 the last few months. Trucks running freight that doesn't always match what's written on paper. And mine fits that pattern. Maybe. He let the words sit there in the cold air between them, flat and unembarrassed, the kind of word a man uses when he has already decided the conversation is a formality, and the conclusion has been written for some time now, long before he ever walked over. Behind him, a few drivers near the fuel pumps had started to notice the particular way attention spreads through a parking lot at this hour, not loud, not obvious, just heads turning a fraction more than necessary. Conversations pausing a half-second too long before resuming at a quieter volume. Maya felt it the way she felt weather changing, an old and reliable instinct, sharpened by 11 months of living inside a lie that could collapse from any direction at any moment without warning. She'd learned exactly how fast a small scene could metastasize into a large one, and exactly how little control she actually had over which way tonight would ultimately tip. Open the trailer, Hutchins said. Not a question, not a request backed by anything resembling articulable cause. Just an assumption dressed up as an instruction delivered with the casual certainty of a man who had clearly given this exact order 100 times before to 100 other drivers who happened to look like her in 100 other lots, just like this one, and never once had to answer for any of it afterward. Maya let the silence stretch for exactly as long as it would take an innocent person to feel mildly inconvenienced rather than alarmed. Long enough to be human, not long enough to look suspicious. I don't believe you've given me a reason to, officer. Something flickered across Hutchins' jaw, not quite anger yet, but the first thin edge of it. The look of a man unaccustomed to being met with anything other than immediate grateful compliance from people. He stopped. He glanced past her toward the trailer's long white flank gleaming dull under the floodlights, and Maya followed his gaze for half a second before catching herself and pulling her eyes back to his face. Behind those steel walls sat nothing but ordinary freight, carefully and deliberately ordinary, every box and pallet chosen and arranged to look like precisely what it claimed to be on the manifest sitting in her glove box. The truth of the operation lived somewhere else entirely, in the relay hidden in the undercarriage in the burner phone locked beside that manifest, in 11 months of patience and discipline that could not survive an unauthorized search tonight, not with the timeline this close to closing for good. Ma'am, Hutchins said, lowering his voice into something he probably believed sounded reasonable, even kind. It'd go a whole lot easier if you just cooperated with us here. Maya looked past him toward the far edge of the lot where a dark SUV sat motionless near the tree-line engine off windows tinted just enough to be unremarkable rather than suspicious, exactly where it was supposed to be and exactly as still as it needed to stay for now. Her backup, watching, waiting on her signal and her signal alone, because the moment they moved without it, the operation was finished regardless of how the next few minutes ended for her personally. She turned back to Hutchins, her voice even almost gentle, pitched to disarm rather than provoke any further. Sometimes what you think you're looking at isn't what's actually there. He frowned, plainly irritated by a sentence that refused to behave like either compliance or defiance that gave him nothing solid to push against. Beck returned from the cruiser at that moment, license in hand, his expression caught somewhere between confusion and the faint discomfort of a man sensing something he couldn't quite name yet. "Clean," Beck said. "No flags. Independent operator, 2 years on record, no priors of any kind." Hutchins didn't look at him. His eyes stayed fixed on Maya, narrowing slightly as though her clean record only confirmed some private theory rather than disproving it entirely. "Sometimes the clean ones are the careful ones," he said, mostly to himself, almost a mutter under his breath, and Maya understood in that moment with a clarity that settled cold and certain low in her chest that nothing about tonight was going to end with a clean record being remotely enough to satisfy him. Somewhere behind her, a trucker's CB radio crackled to life, with a stray transmission, words lost in static before they meant anything. The diner door swung open down the lot, spilling warm light, and the smell of burnt coffee across the gravel before swinging shut again behind whoever had stepped out. The fuel pumps hummed their idle electric hum, patient and indifferent to everything unfolding 20 yards away. The night held its breath the way nights do right before something tips past the point of easy return, and Maya Devereaux, federal agent, not trucker, a woman with a real badge buried in a duffel bag and 11 months of her real life folded somewhere underneath this one, sat very still behind the wheel of a truck that wasn't really hers, in a life that wasn't really hers, and waited to see exactly how far Dale Hutchins intended to take this before the sun finally came up over Nebraska. Hutchins keyed his radio before Maya had even finished answering his last question, calling in a backup request to dispatch in a tone that suggested he'd already decided how the night would unfold and merely needed the paperwork to catch up to the decision he'd made somewhere in the first 30 seconds of the stop. Dispatch requesting additional unit at crossroads mile marker 212. Possible narcotics transport, subject uncooperative. Maya kept her hands resting loosely on the wheel and said nothing because there was nothing useful to say to a man narrating a story to a radio dispatcher that bore almost no relationship to the actual exchange that had just taken place between them in the cold a few feet away. Beck shifted his weight beside the cruiser, glancing toward his training officer with the particular discomfort of a man watching someone build a case out of nothing while expecting him to nod along in agreement. She was cooperative, though he offered quietly, almost apologetic about saying it out loud at all. She was calm, Hutchins corrected, not looking at him, his eyes still fixed on the cab. "Those aren't the same thing." He said it the way a man repeats a lesson he'd been taught long ago and never once thought to question a piece of inherited wisdom passed down through some unspoken academy of suspicion that treated composure itself as evidence of guilt rather than simple character. These independent haulers running this corridor, half of them, are running more than freight underneath the paperwork. You learn to read it after enough years out here. What Hutchins didn't say, what he likely never said out loud to anyone in his life, not even to himself in any honest internal accounting, was the deeper current running beneath that so-called reading. The years of stops just like this one, where the driver's race had done more silent work in his assessment than any actual manifest discrepancy ever could. 3 formal complaints sat quietly in a file somewhere inside the county sheriff's office, all alleging exactly this pattern, all closed without meaningful action, because his uncle occupied the chair that decided which complaints rose to the surface and which got buried beneath routine paperwork and convenient excuses. Tonight, if anyone outside this lot had been counting, would have made a 4th complaint waiting to be filed and forgotten the same way. A few yards away, an older trucker named Earl Whitfield had stepped out of his cab to stretch his legs after 6 straight hours behind the wheel, and he recognized the shape of what was happening almost the instant he saw it. 63 years old. 31 of those years spent hauling freight across every interstate in the lower 48. Earl had crossed paths with Hutchins twice before at this exact rest stop. Once the deputy had torn apart a young black driver's trailer for the better part of 40 minutes and found nothing but the bottled water and tire chains the manifest had promised all along, leaving the young man to repack his entire load alone at 3 in the morning without so much as an apology or an explanation. Another time he'd done the same to a Latino driver hauling fresh produce, citing a smell that turned out to be nothing more exotic or sinister than overripe peaches sweating in the summer heat. Earl had said something to him that second night quietly, just one trucker to another while they waited for Hutchins to finish his pointless search. Something about how he'd been driving this corridor for 3 decades and never once seen a white driver pulled apart like that over a smell nobody else could detect. The other driver had just shaken his head, too tired and too used to it to do anything but wait it out. Earl had mounted a dash cam on his windshield not long after, specifically because of nights like those, and he carried a low, simmering anger that had been waiting more than a year now for somewhere useful to finally land. By now, the lot had begun to gather its quiet audience the way these things always seem to, almost against everyone's better judgment and certainly against anyone's stated intention to mind their own business. A trucker 2 rows over leaned against his rig with his arms crossed, watching openly, without bothering to pretend he wasn't. The gas station clerk, a college-aged kid working the overnight shift alone, drifted toward the front window of the convenience store with a rag still hanging forgotten in one hand, the counter he'd been wiping down abandoned mid-motion. The young couple by the fuel pumps had stopped their quiet argument altogether, both of them now watching the unfolding scene with the particular stillness of people who sensed, without being able to name exactly why, that they were witnessing something that might matter later, in a way most truck stop arguments never did. 2 more drivers emerged from the diner, coffee cups steaming in the cold night air, drawn outside by nothing more concrete than the changed quality of the lot itself. That subtle electric charge that precedes trouble, the way static precedes lightning before a storm finally breaks. Nobody said much at first. A murmur here, a glance exchanged there, phones beginning to emerge from jacket pockets. In that tentative early way people reach for them when they're not yet certain whether what they're about to film will turn out to matter or simply dissolve into nothing, the way most nights eventually do. A woman near the diner entrance pulled her teenage son closer by the shoulder, lowering her voice to explain something he clearly didn't yet fully understand. Even the maintenance worker had stopped pushing his cart, leaning instead against the restroom doorway to watch the squeaking wheel finally silent. Maya, watching all of this assemble itself in her peripheral vision without ever turning her head to confirm it, understood with grim and growing clarity that whatever happened in the next 20 minutes was no longer going to happen privately contained to 3 people and a quiet exchange of documents. It would happen now in front of more than a dozen strangers and at least 3 or 4 cameras, which was either the single worst possible complication for an 11-month undercover operation, or, depending entirely on how the next few minutes actually unfolded, the very thing that might end up saving it from disaster. Hutchins circled back toward the cab, his confidence visibly hardening now that an audience had begun to form around the edges of the scene, the particular bravado of a man who performs differently the instant he becomes aware he's being watched by more than just his own partner. "I'm smelling something off this trailer," he announced, his voice pitched loud enough to carry well past Maya's window to the gathered onlookers. "Chemical smell. You want to tell me what that is, ma'am?" It was not true. There was no chemical smell of any kind. The trailer had been sealed and inspected by the task force's own forensic technicians 48 hours earlier in a secure facility outside Omaha, scrubbed of anything that could possibly draw exactly this kind of unwanted attention from a roadside stop. But truth had stopped being the operative currency of this conversation several minutes ago, somewhere around the moment Hutchins decided his read of the situation outranked anything Maya could say in response, and she understood that correcting him too directly would only sound to both Hutchins and the gathering crowd like protesting too much. "I don't smell anything unusual, officer," she said instead evenly, her voice carrying just enough genuine puzzlement to read as authentic. "But you're welcome to note that in your report. Your manifest doesn't add up either," he continued, undeterred manufacturing cause in real time with the practiced fluency of a man who had clearly done exactly this before and found it worked often enough not to ever abandon the habit. "Says here you're hauling industrial parts. That's an awful lot of declared weight for industrial parts, wouldn't you say? It's all listed on the bill of lading, officer. 41,000 pounds fully axle compliant. You're welcome to verify it against the weigh station logs from this afternoon if you'd like." Her precision frustrated him far more than open defiance would have. Maya watched it land, watched the particular way Hutchins's mouth tightened at being met with exact figures instead of nerves, as though her competence itself constituted the offense, as though a woman who knew her own paperwork down to the pound was somehow more suspicious than one who fumbled and stammered through it. He read her composure as arrogance, because he had no other available frame for understanding a black woman who simply would not flinch under pressure, who answered every accusation with a fact instead of an apology. Hutchins took another slow circuit around the front of the cab, his eyes lingering on the company decal stenciled along the door, the federal inspection sticker affixed near the headlight. The small details he seemed determined to read, as evidence of something rather than simply the ordinary furniture of an ordinary working truck. "You run this route a lot," he said, not quite a question, his tone carrying the particular suspicion of a man who had already decided familiarity itself was suspicious. Same stretch, same stops. Same client mostly, Maya said. Independent operators tend to find a few accounts that pay reliably and stick with them. It's not complicated. He didn't sound convinced, though nothing she'd said offered any actual purchase for doubt. He glanced toward the trailer again, then back at her, something calculating moving behind his eyes that had nothing to do with the manifest in his hand, and everything to do with a story he'd already started telling himself before she'd ever rolled down the window. Inside, beneath the stillness she presented to him, Maya felt something tighten that had nothing to do with fear of arrest, and everything to do with a much older, more familiar exhaustion, the specific fatigue of being disbelieved in real time by someone who had already decided the verdict before the trial began. It wasn't new. She had felt some version of this in academy hallways, in courtroom corridors, in the careful, deliberate stillness she'd had to practice since childhood whenever a stranger's eyes lingered on her a beat too long without quite admitting why. But feeling it now, with 11 months of meticulous federal work hanging in the balance and 3 other agents' safety riding on her ability to absorb one more man's certainty without cracking, made the old fatigue sharper than it had been in years, sharper than she expected it to still be capable of feeling after this much training and this many assignments. She let it move through her chest and out again, the way she'd trained herself to do, refusing to let it surface anywhere near her face or her voice. Anger here would cost her everything. So would visible hurt, however justified. The only currency she could afford to spend tonight was patience, and she spent it now deliberately, like a woman paying down a debt she hadn't chosen to owe, but had learned over a lifetime that she would be billed for regardless. A second patrol car pulled into the lot, then gravel crunching loudly beneath its tires as it rolled to a stop, and a heavy-set sergeant climbed out with the slow, unhurried movements of a man 20 years into a career that had long since stopped surprising him in any meaningful way. Sergeant Cole Bannerman walked over, taking in the entire scene with a single practiced sweep of his eyes. Hutchins's rigid posture, Beck's visible discomfort, the gathering crowd at the edges of the lot, Maya's careful stillness behind the wheel, and exhaled through his nose in a way that suggested he'd arrived at more than one of Hutchins' stops before tonight and recognized the shape of this particular one almost immediately. "What have we got here?" Bannerman said, the words landing less like a genuine question and more like a man already bracing for an answer he wouldn't like. "Possible narcotics transport," subjects being evasive with her answers. "She's answered every single question you've put to her," Bannerman said, glancing once toward Maya, then back toward Hutchins, his tone carrying the flat, practiced weariness of a man who'd learned to pick his battles with younger officers very carefully over the years. "You got probable cause here, Dale, or you got a hunch and a bad feeling." "I've got a profile match and an unusual route pattern." "That's a hunch, Dale. I've sat through 3 reviews this year on stops that started exactly like this one. You remember how those went?" Bannerman's voice dropped lower, meant only for Hutchins. Now, though, the night carried sound further than either man probably realized. "Your uncle's not going to be sitting in that chair forever, you understand me. Things change. I'd rather you not be the reason they change faster." Hutchins' jaw worked silently for a moment, the comment landing somewhere it clearly wasn't meant to be acknowledged out loud. Not here, not in front of Beck, and not in front of a parking lot full of strangers with their phones raised. "I'm following procedure," he said again, quieter this time, though the words had lost some of their earlier conviction. Maya kept her face carefully neutral while something in her chest tightened considerably at the exchange, because the honest stakes mattered enormously here, and nobody else standing in this parking lot understood exactly how much was riding on the next 60 seconds. If Hutchins forced this trailer open without a warrant, without any legitimate cause, the search itself would almost certainly be ruled illegal later, which meant, in a strange and bitter irony she had no time to fully appreciate, in the moment, that nothing he found inside would ever be admissible in any court, that an unlawful search might actually end up protecting the operation's most sensitive secrets from ever becoming part of any public legal record. But that distant legal technicality offered her absolutely no protection in the present moment, no comfort whatsoever against the much larger and more immediate danger sitting just beneath it. If Hutchins forced the trailer open and discovered the hidden relay equipment bolted carefully into the undercarriage, photographs of it alone, leaked, accidentally subpoenaed eventually, or simply described too loosely by the wrong officer, in the wrong bar to the wrong listening ear, could reach the pipeline's network well before sunrise. 2 agents working 3 states away right now, agents who trusted her cover completely because they had no other choice but to trust it would receive no warning whatsoever before the men they'd spent months investigating simply vanished, rerouted their entire operation overnight, or worse, concluded that someone among their own ranks had finally talked. 11 months. 11 months of patient, careful, exhausting work, balanced now on a knife's edge of whether one wounded deputy's bruised ego would ultimately override his own sergeant's better judgment in the next 60 seconds of a cold Nebraska night. "Let her go, Dale," Bannerman said, finally loud enough now for the decision to register publicly, a clear line drawn in front of witnesses. "We've got nothing solid here, and you know it as well as I do." For a moment, something in Hutchins seemed to visibly deflate the bravado, losing air all at once, the way it tends to when someone finally calls the bluff, aloud in front of witnesses, with no graceful way left to double down. He glanced briefly toward the gathered crowd, toward the handful of phones still raised at the edges of his vision, and for just a few seconds Maya allowed herself something close to genuine relief, a loosening in her shoulders she hadn't fully realized until that moment she'd been holding so tightly. "Fine," Hutchins said, stepping back from the window, at last, his voice flattened by something that might have passed for embarrassment in a different kind of man entirely. "Have a good night, ma'am." He turned and walked back toward his cruiser, Beck falling into step a half-pace behind him, and for almost a full minute the entire lot seemed to exhale right along with Maya. Conversations resumed at something closer to their normal nighttime volume. The trucker 2 rows over finally uncrossed his arms. Earl Whitfield lowered his phone slightly, though he didn't put it away and on his pocket entirely, some old instinct telling him this wasn't quite finished yet. Maya reached for the key still sitting in the ignition, allowing herself the smallest, most carefully contained breath of relief, the kind she would never have permitted to show openly on her face, but that nonetheless moved through her chest, like something physically loosening after being clenched for far too long. It lasted 90 seconds, perhaps less. Hutchins emerged from his cruiser, not with an apology and not with a wave, but with a radio handset still pressed firmly to one ear, his expression rearranged into something sharper than before, something that had clearly found fresh fuel during whatever brief conversation had just taken place over the airwaves. "K, 9 units 2 minutes out," he announced, his voice pitched loud enough for the entire gathered crowd to hear clearly, functioning less as genuine information now and more as outright performance for the small audience he'd accumulated. Dog already flagged a similar profile vehicle on this exact route last month. "We are not releasing this truck until we've cleared it properly by the book." Earl Whitfield, who had drifted a few steps closer during the brief lull, raised his phone again as Hutchins's announcement landed across the lot. "K9 unit," he repeated mostly to himself, shaking his head slowly. "Now that's a new wrinkle. Didn't pull that one out on the last 2 drivers I watched him stop." He said it loud enough to carry not quite to Hutchins directly, but clearly intended for the gathering crowd, a quiet seed planted in the minds of everyone now watching that this particular escalation to fit a pattern rather than standing alone. Bannerman's jaw visibly tightened, the look of a man recognizing in real time that he'd just been outmaneuvered by his own subordinate in front of an audience neither of them could now back away from gracefully without losing face. "Dale, hold on a second. I'm following procedure, Sergeant." Hutchins' voice had hardened into something with real teeth in it now. The earlier brief performance of reasonableness entirely abandoned and discarded. He turned back toward Maya's window, and whatever fragile equilibrium had existed between them a minute earlier had collapsed completely and without warning. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle right now." Maya felt the shift in the air the way she'd felt it building gradually all night long, except now it finally had both a direction and a deadline attached to it. The dark SUV at the tree line remained perfectly motionless, still waiting patiently on a signal she could not yet afford to give, while 20 yards away, a man who had decided his own version of events mattered more than any fact standing directly in front of him, prepared to make a decision that could not easily be undone once it was made. Sergeant Bannerman had a real chance right there in that exact moment to end this before it ever went any further, and instead he let it slide rather than stand his ground against his own subordinate in front of a crowd. Have you ever watched someone in a position of real authority choose comfort and convenience over doing the right thing, even when they clearly knew better? Deep down, if this story already has you gripping your seat, do us a favor and hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps stories exactly like this one reach more people who need to see precisely how this plays out before the night is over. The night had stopped holding its breath entirely. It had started instead to move. Maya stepped down from the cab slowly, deliberately, the gravel cold and uneven beneath her boots, every motion calibrated to communicate compliance rather than threat. She had rehearsed this exact kind of moment before in training scenarios designed at Quantico to simulate precisely this sort of escalation under controlled, supervised conditions, but no simulation had ever managed to replicate the particular weight of doing it for real in front of strangers with everything she'd built over 11 months, balanced precariously on how the next few minutes unfolded, in front of a parking lot full of witnesses she had never met and would likely never see again. Hutchins' hand drifted toward his holster Not drawing, not yet, but close enough that the gesture itself functioned as a kind of unspoken threat, a silent escalation layered beneath whatever he said next. "Hands where I can see them." "They are," Maya said, and they were both palms open and visible at her sides, the posture of someone who understood exactly how quickly these encounters could turn, and had no intention of giving him any excuse to claim otherwise, later in whatever report he would eventually have to write to justify all of this. A K9 cruiser pulled into the lot. At that moment, its arrival announced by the low, restless bark carrying from inside before the vehicle had even fully stopped. The handler, a stocky officer Maya hadn't seen before, climbed out and began leashing a German shepherd that strained eagerly against its harness, sensing the charged atmosphere of the scene before its handler had given it any actual command. About time, Hutchins called out some of his earlier bravado, returning now that reinforcement had finally arrived in a form he could point to as legitimizing everything he'd already decided to do. "Run her around the trailer." The handler hesitated, glancing between Hutchins and Bannerman, clearly sensing some unspoken tension in the lot that hadn't been explained to him over the radio. "You got the dog requested for an actual alert, or just a perimeter sweep?" "Sweep first," Hutchins said. "We'll see what she does." Beneath the stillness, her pulse had climbed considerably, a fact she registered with clinical detachment, even as she refused to let it surface anywhere visible. Years of training had taught her to separate the physiological response from the outward presentation, to let her body do what bodies do. Under genuine threat, the elevated heart rate, the heightened awareness, narrowing her focus to every small movement around her, the faint tremor she suppressed in her hands by keeping them loosely open rather than clenched into fists, without permitting any of it to leak into her face or her voice. This was the part of the job nobody outside federal law enforcement ever fully understood, the part that never made it into the recruitment posters or the academy brochures, that courage in moments like this had almost nothing to do with the absence of fear and everything to do with the discipline required to function flawlessly, despite it, to keep your voice level while your heart is hammering, to keep your hands soft while every instinct screams to protect yourself. She thought briefly and involuntarily of her mother's voice from childhood. The careful instructions repeated so many times over the years, they'd become reflex long before Maya ever needed them. In any official law enforcement capacity, keep your hands visible, speak slowly, don't make sudden movements, survive the encounter first, and address the injustice of it later when you're safe enough to do so without risking your life in the process. She had needed that lesson as a 12-year-old girl riding quietly in the back seat of her father's sedan during a stop that had ended eventually without incident but had stayed lodged in her memory for decades afterward regardless. She needed it now, more than 2 decades later, standing on a very different kind of front line, entirely for reasons her mother could never have fully imagined when she first taught her that lesson, but would have understood instantly and completely all the same. The dog circled the trailer twice, nose working methodically along the seams of the cargo doors, and gave no indication of any alert whatsoever. No sitting, no scratching, none of the trained signals the handler clearly knew to look for. He straightened up after the second pass, looking faintly puzzled. Nothing here, no alert. "Run her again," Hutchins said, an edge entering his voice. "I ran her twice. She's not flagging anything, officer. I can't manufacture an alert that isn't there." The words landed in the cold air with more weight than the handler probably intended, a quiet professional rebuke from someone with no stake in the outcome beyond doing his job correctly. Hutchins' jaw tightened, the last external justification he'd been counting on evaporating in front of the very crowd he'd invoked it for. Earl Whitfield had moved closer now, phone raised steady in both hands, no longer pretending to be a passive bystander, content to watch from a comfortable distance. "I've seen this before," he said, loud enough to carry clearly across the lot, his voice carrying the particular unshakable authority of someone old enough and tired enough to no longer care whether speaking up made anyone around him uncomfortable. Same deputy, same exact trailer search routine, 2 different drivers this year alone that I personally witnessed. I've got dashcam footage of the last one sitting on a hard drive at home if anybody wants to compare notes side by side. Hutchins' head snapped toward him, his expression hardening further. "Sir, step back. This doesn't concern you." "I'm a witness," Earl said, not stepping back even an inch. "Makes it concern me plenty far, as I'm aware of how this country's supposed to work. I will cite you for obstruction if you don't back away from this vehicle right now, sir. Last warning." "Cite away, then." Earl held his phone steady, unflinching, the kind of calm that comes only from a man who has genuinely run out of patience for being told to mind his own business, while watching the same injustice repeat itself in front of him for the 3rd documented time. "I'll make sure the footage of that gets uploaded right alongside everything else you're doing here tonight, officer. Every bit of it time-stamped." "You don't know the first thing about what's going on here." Hutchins snapped some of his composure, finally cracking under the weight of an audience that refused to simply watch in silence. "This isn't your business." "My business is watching a man get treated like a criminal for driving a truck while black same as I watched it happen to 2 other men this year." Earl said, his voice rising now to make sure everyone in earshot heard him clearly. "3rd time's the charm, I guess, except this time I'm not the only one filming." A murmur of agreement moved through the crowd, low but unmistakable, and Maya felt something shift in the balance of the lot. The silent calculation in dozens of strangers' minds, tipping visibly from passive observation toward something closer to collective witness. The gas station clerk had inched closer still, phone steady. The woman near the diner who had pulled her son close earlier now stood with her own phone raised, her expression hardened into something resolute. A man Maya hadn't noticed before, leaning against a pickup near the diner entrance, called out without raising his voice. "Much I'm a process server, ma'am. Used to courtrooms. Everything he's doing right now, every word of it is getting written down somewhere, whether he likes it or not." A younger woman standing near the convenience store, who Maya placed somewhere in her 20s, pulled out her own phone and began narrating quietly into it, the unmistakable posture of someone live streaming rather than simply recording for later. "If you're watching this right now," she said, low but audible, "I'm at a truck stop off I-80 in Nebraska, and a cop is about to search a woman's trailer with no warrant that I can see, and the dog they brought in just cleared it. There's a sergeant standing right there who already told him not to do this." Hutchins's eyes cut toward her sharply, and for a moment something like genuine alarm flickered across his face at the realization that this might not stay contained to a handful of phones reviewed later, but could already be moving live across the internet while he stood there. The lot itself seemed to have changed shape around the confrontation. The ordinary geometry of parked rigs and fuel islands now arranged almost accidentally into something resembling an amphitheater, every angle offering some stranger and unobstructed view of what was happening at the trailer's rear doors. The floodlights overhead buzzed their same steady buzz, indifferent to the fact that they were now illuminating something far more consequential than a routine traffic stop. Steam rose from abandoned coffee cups set down on hoods and railings as their owners forgot entirely about drinking them. Somewhere a truck's CB radio left on inside an empty cab crackled with a stray transmission from another driver miles away, oblivious to everything unfolding here, a strange reminder that the rest of the world continued on, indifferent to this particular crisis. The temperature had dropped further still, the kind of cold that made breath visible in short controlled clouds, and Maya noticed even now the absurd detail of frost beginning to form along the chrome trim of a nearby bumper, beautiful and entirely irrelevant to the danger closing in around her. Hutchins cornered now by an audience he could no longer control, by a dog that had refused to give him the cause he'd promised, and by his own escalating claims that had nowhere left to retreat to, gracefully without losing every shred of authority he'd spent the last 20 minutes performing, made the decision that would ultimately define the rest of the night for everyone present. He stepped past Bannerman's half-raised, half-hearted hand, walked directly to the trailer's rear doors, and gripped the latch with a finality that suggested he had stopped weighing consequences entirely. "Officer, you don't have a warrant," Maya said, her voice still controlled, though something underneath it had sharpened now into the precise, deliberate tone of someone establishing a clear record rather than simply objecting in the moment. "Your own K-9 unit just cleared this vehicle. You don't have probable cause. Opening that trailer right now is an unlawful search, and I need you to understand I'm telling you that calmly as a fact, not as a threat of any kind." "I've got reasonable suspicion," Hutchins snapped back without releasing the latch, the dog's failure to alert seeming only to harden his resolve rather than soften it. "Dale." Bannerman's voice carried real warning, now sharper than anything he'd said all night. The dog cleared her. "You open that now, you've got nothing admissible and you know it. Nothing holds up in front of a judge if you jump the gun like this, and I am not signing my name to this report." "Then don't," Hutchins said flatly, not even looking at him. A beat of silence followed, heavy, with everything neither man was willing to say directly in front of a crowd. Bannerman's hand drifted toward his own radio, hesitated, then dropped back to his side, the moment of intervention slipping past. Unused, swallowed by hierarchy and inertia, and whatever quiet calculations sergeants make about which battles are worth the paperwork and which aren't. The K-9 handler, watching this unfold a few feet away, exchanged a brief glance with Bannerman, something unspoken passing between two men who clearly recognized the same thing happening in front of them and felt equally powerless for reasons of rank and procedure to stop it outright. He pulled his dog back a few steps, putting visible distance between himself and whatever was about to happen next, a small physical disavowal that Maya noted even through the tightening pressure of the moment. Hutchins ignored him entirely. Now his focus narrowed down completely to the latch beneath his fingers, and the woman standing several feet away who had not once in this entire prolonged encounter given him the reaction he clearly believed on some level he was owed by now. "Beck," Hutchins said, not turning around to look at him. "Hold her." Beck hesitated. Maya watched it happen in real time, the visible flicker of doubt crossing the younger officer's face, the half-second pause where some better instinct fought visibly against the conditioned reflex to follow a training officer's direct order without question or hesitation. It wasn't enough. The hesitation lasted barely a single breath before training and hierarchy won out decisively over whatever quieter conscience had briefly and unsuccessfully surfaced, and Beck stepped forward, gripping Maya's arm with more force than the situation actually required. His grip closed around her wrist with more force than the moment genuinely required, fingers digging in hard enough that she knew, with the detached clinical part of her mind that never fully stopped cataloging evidence, even under direct physical duress, that there would be a faint bruise there by morning. A small physical record of exactly how this had gone, the kind of detail an incident report would eventually need to capture precisely. The fluorescent light above the trailer doors flickered once, twice an old bulb struggling visibly against the cold, casting the entire scene in brief alternating intervals of harsher white light and near shadow. Somewhere behind her, an idling engine shifted gears with a low metallic groan that seemed to underscore the tension rather than interrupt it. The cold had deepened considerably in the last 20 minutes, settling into something with real teeth in it now, and she felt it acutely against the exposed skin where Beck's grip had pushed her sleeve up slightly in the process of restraining her. The K-9 handler, watching from a few feet away, had gone very quiet, the dog seated obediently at his side, both of them now visibly uninvolved in whatever was happening at the trailer doors. Hutchins produced a pair of handcuffs from his belt with his free hand, the metal catching what little available light there was, a small definitive click as he opened them, the sound somehow louder and more final than anything else happening in the entire lot at that exact moment. "This is not a lawful detention," Maya said, her voice still level despite the hand clamped firmly around her wrist, despite the open handcuffs now visible in Hutchins's other hand. "I am not resisting in any way. I am stating clearly and on the record for everyone present that you do not have legal authority to do this to me right now." "Save it for the judge," Hutchins said, reaching past her toward the latch a second time, his patience for her composure clearly exhausted entirely. The crowd's reaction shifted from murmur to something closer to open, audible outrage. "This is wrong," a woman's voice called out clearly from somewhere near the diner entrance. "Y'all are seeing this, right? The dog cleared her, and he's still doing this." A second voice, a man this time somewhere near the fuel pumps, added flatly, "I already called my brother, he's a lawyer. He says, don't anybody touch that truck without paperwork." Earl Whitfield's voice rose above the general noise, steady and furious in equal measure. "I've got this whole thing on camera, officer, every single second of it, start to finish. You want to think real carefully about what you do next here, because there's no taking any of this back once it's out there." Hutchins' hand closed fully around the latch. In that exact instant, headlights swept hard across the lot from the direction of the tree line, 3 sets igniting at once, engines that had sat silent and patient for the better part of 40 minutes, now closing the distance with a speed and coordination that suggested whatever signal had finally been given had been given decisively and without further hesitation. The dark SUV led the convergence, 2 more vehicles flanking it tightly on either side, all 3 pulling to a stop in a tight, practiced formation that had nothing chaotic about it, and everything entirely deliberate, the unmistakable choreography of people who had trained for exactly this kind of approach more times than any of them could easily count. Hutchins is 1 latch away from destroying 11 months of federal undercover work, and he has absolutely no idea what he's about to walk into. What do you think happens in the next 60 seconds? Does he stop, or does he actually go through with it anyway? Drop your prediction in the comments before you keep watching, and if your stomach is in knots right now, that's exactly the reaction this story is built for. Don't forget to subscribe our channel so you catch the next one the moment it drops. Car doors opened in near unison, fast, but fully controlled the particular discipline of people who had rehearsed exactly this kind of coordinated approach more times than any of them could readily recall. The crowd, sensing the shift before they fully understood what was happening, instinctively drew back several feet to give the new arrivals room, the collective body language of dozens of people recalibrating in real time to a development none of them had anticipated. The young woman who had been live streaming turned her phone toward the new arrivals without missing a beat, her narration shifting into something breathless. "Okay, something's happening. There's 3 more vehicles. These don't look like normal cops. Hang on. Hutchins' latch, still gripped tightly in one hand, turned toward the sudden movement, with the confused, half-defensive posture of a man who had not anticipated any of this whatsoever, and had no existing framework yet for understanding what was unfolding directly in front of him. Beck's grip on Maya's wrist loosened slightly instinctively as his attention split toward the new arrivals, his hand falling away entirely a moment later, as though some part of him had already understood before his conscious mind caught up exactly what was coming. Bannerman, several feet behind them, both had gone very still, the particular stillness of a man watching a situation he'd already tried twice to prevent finally arrive at the consequence he'd warned it would. "Federal agents," a woman's voice called out, clear and absolute, cutting cleanly through the cold night air with an authority that needed no raised volume whatsoever to carry across the entire lot. "Step away from my agent, now." The latch slipped from Hutchins's fingers, forgotten entirely, and immediately as the full weight of those 4 words began slowly and visibly to register across his face in real time, the 3 vehicles emptied fast, but without chaos, doors swinging open in the same disciplined rhythm, with which they'd arrived, agents fanning out across the gravel in a pattern that had clearly been drilled into muscle memory long before tonight ever happened. At the center of it walked a woman in her 50s, gray-streaked hair pulled back tight against the cold federal credentials already raised in one hand as she crossed the distance toward the trailer with the unhurried absolute authority of someone who had never once in her career needed to raise her voice to be obeyed. Assistant Special Agent in charge. Renata Ford did not look at Hutchins first. She looked at Beck's hand still loosely circling Maya's wrist, and her voice, when it came, carried the precise temperature of ice. I said, "Step away from my agent." Beck released Maya's arm as though it had become suddenly physically hot, stumbling back half a step, his face draining of color even before he fully understood why his body had reacted before his mind caught up to the words. Hutchins, still holding the trailer's open latch, found himself unable to produce words. For several long seconds, his mind visibly scrambling to reconcile the scene in front of him with anything he'd believed to be true 20 minutes earlier. She's the subject of an active, she's a senior special agent with the Drug Enforcement Administration, Ford said, cutting through whatever sentence he'd been attempting to construct, her voice carrying easily across the now silent lot. 11 months deep undercover on a federal narcotics investigation that you have just come within seconds of compromising entirely and very nearly destroying altogether. Maya straightened to her full height for the first time all night, the careful smallness she had performed for 11 months falling away from her shoulders like a coat she no longer needed to wear in this particular weather. She reached beneath the collar of her jacket into the hidden interior pocket sewn there for exactly this purpose, a pocket she had checked the stitching on more times than she could count over the past 11 months, and produced a slim leather credential case worn soft at the corners from being carried unused for so long. She opened it with a single deliberate motion and held it up angled so the floodlight caught it directly and threw the reflection outward across the gathered crowd. The badge inside gleamed gold under that harsh white light, the federal eagle stamped across its face, catching the glow and throwing it back in sharp relief. Every line of the engraving visible even from several feet away, the holographic seal embedded beside it, shifting faintly between colors as the angle changed with the small movement of her hand, the kind of detail that could not be faked or duplicated by anyone outside the agency itself. The kind of detail every officer present recognized instantly as authentic. Beneath the badge sat her identification card, laminated and precise. Her real name, her real rank, her real photograph, staring back at the very crowd that had spent the last 20 minutes watching a different woman entirely, a woman who didn't exist outside this assignment. Devereaux Maya R., Special Agent, Drug Enforcement Administration. 5 full seconds passed in absolute silence. Hutchins's hand was still on the latch, frozen there, as though he'd forgotten it was even attached to his body. His face, which had carried such unshakable certainty for the better part of an hour, drained of color in visible stages. First, the high color along his cheekbones fading entirely, then the set of his jaw loosening as whatever script he'd been running collapsed all at once. Then something close to gray settling beneath his eyes, as the full weight of what he had nearly done crashed over him in a single, overwhelming instant. A thin sheen of sweat broke out along his hairline despite the cold, despite the fact that the temperature had done nothing but drop steadily for the last hour, his body betraying him in ways his face could no longer control. His grip on the latch slackened entirely, his hand falling away from the metal as though it had grown too heavy to hold up any longer, the small sound of his fingers releasing the only sound in the entire lot. Beck had already backed up several feet, his own face pale, his eyes moving rapidly between Maya's badge and his training officer's frozen expression, visibly recalculating every single decision he'd made in the last hour under Hutchins's direction, the realization spreading across his young face that obedience had nearly made him complicit in something far larger than he'd understood. The crowd's reaction arrived a half-beat behind the silence, a collective intake of breath, audible even from yards away, followed by a low ripple of disbelief moving through the gathered onlookers, like a current finding its path through still water. Phones that had been recording steadily for 20 minutes now seemed to rise even higher, as though everyone present understood simultaneously and without needing to discuss it, that whatever had just happened needed to be captured in full, every second of it preserved. "I was just doing my job." Hutchins finally managed the words coming out smaller than anything he'd said all night, stripped entirely of the bravado that had carried him confidently through every previous sentence of this encounter. "Your job," Ford repeated, her voice flat and entirely unimpressed, "was to conduct a lawful stop based on actual probable cause. What you did instead was fabricate a chemical odor that doesn't exist, override your own K, 9 units clean result, and authorize unlawful physical restraint of a federal agent in front of a dozen witnesses with their phones out. That is not doing your job, Officer Hutchins. That is the textbook definition of misconduct, compounded by the fact that you had clear, documented evidence in front of you twice that should have ended this stop, and you chose to ignore it because it didn't fit the conclusion you'd already reached before you ever approached her window. As of right now, every part of it is going into a federal incident report with your name attached." Hutchins glanced toward the open trailer doors, then back to Ford, something desperate creeping into his expression. "I had reports, tips about a profile match. I wasn't just making this up out of nowhere." Ford glanced toward the K-9 handler, who was still standing a short distance away with his dog seated calmly at his side. "Your dog ran this trailer twice and gave no alert, is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am," the handler said. "Told him that twice myself. Clean sweep, no indication of anything." "And he proceeded to open the trailer anyway?" "He did." Ford turned back to Hutchins, something colder settling into her expression. "So you didn't just fabricate a chemical odor. You overruled your own K, 9 units clean result, and attempted an unlawful search regardless. That's not an officer making an honest mistake under pressure, Officer Hutchins. That's an officer who had already decided the outcome before any evidence existed and kept manufacturing justification after justification until something finally stuck or until somebody stopped you. Tonight it was the second one." "Whose tips?" Ford asked, and the question landed with a weight Hutchins clearly hadn't anticipated. He hesitated. "Anonymous, came through dispatch." "We'll be requesting those dispatch logs," Ford said. "Every timestamp, every call, every name attached to whoever phoned in a profile match for a truck with a completely clean record. Given the pattern we're already seeing in your file, Officer Hutchins, I suspect what we find is going to look a lot less like an anonymous tip and a lot more like a habit you've built over several years without anyone holding you accountable for it." The accusation landed visibly, Hutchins's jaw tightening, as though he wanted to argue and had nothing left to argue with. He looked for a moment toward Bannerman, as though hoping his sergeant might step in and soften what was happening, find some procedural off-ramp that could still salvage the night. Bannerman did not meet his eyes. One of Ford's agents approached quietly and murmured something near her ear. Ford nodded once, then addressed the lot at large, her voice carrying the particular clarity of someone accustomed to managing a scene with many moving parts at once. "I need everyone here to understand something important. Nothing you witnessed tonight involving the contents of this trailer or this woman's true identity can be discussed publicly until this investigation formally closes. Your safety and the safety of agents working other parts of this case right now depends on that. I'm not asking you to delete your footage. That footage may end up being critical evidence. I'm asking you to hold it and to let us know if you're contacted by anyone asking questions about what happened here tonight." A murmur of understanding moved through the crowd, the gravity of the request landing visibly on more than a few faces. The young woman who had been live streaming lowered her phone slightly, looking uncertain for the first time all night. "Should I take down what I already posted?" she asked, directing the question toward one of the agents standing nearest her. "We'll have someone reach out to walk you through that," the agent said gently. "For now, just don't post anything further and hang on to everything you've already recorded." Sergeant Bannerman had already taken several visible steps back from Hutchins's side, his posture shifting into something that unmistakably read as distancing himself, a man recognizing in real time exactly how much space he needed to put between himself and whatever came next for his subordinate. "For the record," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the lot, "I advised against opening that trailer without cause. Twice in front of witnesses." "Noted," Ford said without looking at him, her attention still fixed entirely on Hutchins. "We'll need a complete written statement from you separately, Sergeant, and from your deputy as well." "Of course," Bannerman said quickly, "whatever you need." The collective mood of the lot had transformed entirely in the space of less than a minute, disbelief shifting visibly into something closer to vindication, for nearly everyone present, a tangible release of the tension that had been building steadily for the better part of half an hour. The woman who had called out from near the diner now stood with one hand pressed flat to her chest, shaking her head slowly, murmuring something to her teenage son that Maya couldn't quite hear but could easily guess the shape of something about paying attention, about remembering this. The gas station clerk had lowered his phone slightly, his expression somewhere between shock and something that looked almost like quiet pride at having captured all of it. Two truckers near the fuel pumps were already comparing footage on their respective phones, replaying the moment Maya raised her badge, the recordings catching the gold of it from two slightly different angles, already discussing where else to send it. The man who'd identified himself as a process server gave a low, satisfied whistle and said, mostly to himself, but loud enough to carry, "Well, I'll be. Didn't see that coming, and I've seen plenty in my line of work." A ripple of conversation moved through the crowd, now no longer hushed voices rising and overlapping as people processed aloud what they'd just witnessed somebody saying. She knew something was off the whole time. You could just tell somebody else saying they'd never seen anything quite like this. In 30 years of stopping at this exact rest stop on this exact route, the energy of the lot, which had spent the last half hour tightening steadily towards something dangerous and unresolved, released all at once into something closer to collective astonishment, and for more than a few people standing there, quiet relief that the worst possible outcome hadn't actually come to pass. Officer Hutchins Ford continued, her voice carrying the particular weariness of someone who had clearly read this exact kind of file before, more than once, in more than one county, across more than one state. "This is the third formal complaint that will be filed against you this year, alone, for conduct nearly identical to tonight's. Did you know that already, or did your uncle's position make sure those complaints never quite crossed your desk the way they should have?" Hutchins said nothing at all. There was nothing left for him to say that wouldn't make an already catastrophic situation measurably worse. "Sheriff Whitcomb retires at the end of this month," Ford added almost conversationally, though the words landed with considerable weight, given everything that had just happened. "Whoever takes his place is going to inherit this file, along with everything else currently sitting in it. I'd start thinking very carefully about how you want the next chapter of your career to read, Officer Hutchins, because right now the current draft isn't flattering in the slightest." Hutchins said nothing in response, his eyes fixed somewhere on the gravel between his boots, the silence stretching long enough that it became its own kind of answer. Ford's phone buzzed once in her jacket pocket. She glanced at it briefly, her expression shifting almost imperceptibly, then turned to one of her agents. "Tell Reyes and Okafor the timeline holds. Tell them we're still on schedule for the morning convergence, 4 hours behind original projection, but otherwise intact." She looked back toward Maya for the first time since the badge had come out, something softening fractionally in her expression. Your cover held Agent Devereaux. Barely. But it held. Maya allowed herself the smallest exhale, the first one all night, that didn't require calculation behind it. Barely as generous, she said quietly, just between the two of them. Another 30 seconds and we'd be having a very different conversation right now. Then it's a good thing we weren't. 30 seconds later, Ford said something almost gentle, moving briefly across her otherwise composed expression before it settled back into its professional register. Go sit in the SUV. Get warm. We'll need your statement, but it can wait 10 minutes. The younger agent, who'd been quietly photographing the scene since arriving, stepped forward and said something low to Ford that Maya couldn't quite catch. Ford nodded once, then turned her attention to Beck, who had remained frozen near the cruiser, looking very much like a man bracing for a verdict. You, Ford said, not unkindly. You hesitated before you grabbed her arm. I saw it. Why? Beck swallowed hard. Because she hadn't done anything, ma'am. The whole stop, she just answered every question. Didn't give him a single reason. And you grabbed her anyway. He's my training officer, Beck said, and the words sounded smaller and more honest than anything else he'd said all night. I've been on the job 4 months. I didn't know what else to do. Now, you do, Ford said simply. Hesitating because something feels wrong is supposed to mean something, Officer Beck. Next time, let it. Better still say something out loud the moment you feel it, even if your training officer outranks you, especially then. Beck nodded, looking for the first time since the SUVs had arrived, like a man who might actually carry that lesson forward instead of letting it fade by morning. He glanced once toward Hutchins, who still hadn't moved from beside the trailer, and something in his expression suggested he was already beginning to separate in his own mind the man he'd been training under from the kind of officer he still hoped to become. The K-9 handler, still standing nearby with his dog, approached Ford on his own initiative once the scene had settled enough to permit it. Ma'am, for the record, I want to make sure it's documented that my dog gave a clean sweep twice. No alert, no indication, nothing. I told Officer Hutchins that clearly before he proceeded. It's documented, Ford said, and appreciated. Not every officer in your position would have spoken up on his own. Didn't seem right to stay quiet about it, the handler said simply, and there was something in the plainness of the statement that struck Maya more than any of the louder reactions around her. An ordinary man doing an ordinary part of his job, honestly, in a moment when dishonesty would have cost him nothing. Earl Whitfield, who had lowered his phone but kept it recording the entire time, stepped forward as Ford turned her attention toward him at last. Sir, she said, her tone shifting into something noticeably warmer, more deliberate and genuinely appreciative. I understand you have footage of prior incidents involving this officer. 2 of them, Earl confirmed, his voice steadier now that the immediate danger of the moment had passed, though something in it still carried the residue of the anger he'd been quietly holding on to for over a year now. Different drivers both times. Same exact routine, almost word for word. I should have sent it to somebody a long time ago instead of just sitting on it like I did. We'd like to formally request copies if you're willing to provide them, Ford said. Your footage tonight, along with whatever you have from before, is going to matter a great deal in how all of this ultimately gets handled. Whatever you need from me, Earl said simply. Took long enough for somebody official to finally ask. 11 months of undercover work nearly destroyed by one man's assumptions, saved in the final seconds by a witness who'd been quietly collecting evidence for over a year without anyone ever asking him to. Have you ever watched someone's patience finally pay off after being ignored for so long by the people who should have listened sooner? If this story is hitting you the way it's hitting us, share it with someone who needs to see exactly how this one ends. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what happens next. Maya finally lowered her credentials, slipping them back into the hidden pocket with the same careful precision she'd used to produce them moments earlier, though something in her posture remained noticeably different now than it had been all night. No longer folded small, no longer performing harmlessness for an audience that had never deserved the performance in the first place. She glanced once toward Hutchins, who would not meet her eyes at all, and once toward Beck, whose face still carried the particular shock of a young officer realizing all at once and far too late exactly how much damage following orders without question could ultimately cause. "For what it's worth," she said quietly to no one in particular, her voice carrying the exhaustion of 11 months finally surfacing. "Now that it was safe to let it show, I would have preferred tonight never happened at all. But it did. So now we deal with what it actually is and what it almost cost." Behind her, the trailer's rear doors remained closed. The ordinary freight inside still ordinary, still exactly what the manifest claimed it to be, the operation's deeper secrets still intact, behind a search that had never quite been completed in time. Somewhere beyond the tree line, the night was beginning almost imperceptibly to soften toward morning. Officer Dale Hutchins was relieved of duty on the spot before the sun came up, his service weapon and badge collected by his own department's internal affairs liaison, while Ford's team finished documenting the scene with the same methodical precision they brought to everything else. There was no dramatic perp walk, no handcuffs of his own. Nothing the gathered crowd could point to as theatrical justice, in the way these things sometimes played out in movies, just a quiet procedural unraveling that somehow felt more permanent for its complete lack of spectacle. His uncle's position as outgoing sheriff, the very thing that had shielded him through 3 prior complaints over the years, offered no protection at all once the matter became federal. Civil rights violations and obstruction of a federal investigation did not care whose nephew you happened to be, did not bend to local politics or family connections the way county-level complaints sometimes quietly did. A second internal affairs officer arrived just before sunrise to take Bannerman's statement on scene, the sergeant speaking carefully and at length, his account matching word for word in every detail Maya could hear exactly what had actually happened. He did not soften Hutchins's conduct. He did not omit his own hesitation in the moments it might have mattered most. When the officer finished and stepped away to make a call, Bannerman remained standing near his cruiser for a long moment, staring out at the lightening horizon, looking like a man calculating exactly how much of his own career he'd nearly let slip away by staying quiet a few minutes too long. Beck approached Maya before the scene fully cleared, his posture stiff with the particular discomfort of someone uncertain whether an apology would be welcome or simply make things worse. "Agent Devereaux," he said, carefully testing the name. "For what it's worth, I am sorry. I should have said something the second Sergeant Bannerman told him to stand down." "You're 4 months on the job," Maya said, not unkindly, studying him for a moment before continuing. "You're going to spend the rest of your career remembering tonight, every time someone above you tells you to do something that doesn't sit right. That's not nothing, Officer Beck. That's actually the beginning of becoming the kind of officer this job needs more of." He nodded, something easing slightly in his shoulders, though the weight of the night would clearly stay with him far longer than this single conversation could resolve. He hesitated, then added almost as an afterthought, "I think I'm going to ask for a transfer, different training officer. I don't think I can ride with him again knowing what I know now." "That's not a small decision," Maya said, "but it's the right one. Don't let anybody talk you out of it." Maya watched the scene continue to unwind around her from a distance, leaning against the side of her trailer with a blanket someone from Ford's team had draped over her shoulders without asking more out of procedure than because she was actually cold in any way that mattered. She felt no triumph in watching Hutchins' career dissolve in real time in front of her. There was no satisfaction in it the way she might have once imagined satisfaction would feel back before 11 months of living someone else's life had worn away whatever appetite she'd once had for vindication, as a feeling rather than simply a function, a box that needed checking before the real work could continue. What she felt instead was something closer to exhaustion, mixed with a narrow, specific kind of relief. The relief of knowing that 11 months of patient Vine's exhausting work had survived a margin so thin it barely qualified as survival at all, in any honest accounting of how close tonight had actually come to disaster If Ford's team had arrived 90 seconds later, if Earl Whitfield hadn't happened to be parked in this exact lot tonight of all nights, if Bannerman had pushed back harder against Hutchins, or not pushed back at all, and simply let the whole thing collapse sooner. The entire operation, 11 months of careful, deliberate construction, had balanced on a sequence of small mercies that had nothing whatsoever to do with planning and everything to do with luck, and that fact unsettled her considerably more than anything Hutchins himself had said or done over the course of the night. She thought of Reyes and Okafor still embedded 3 states away, at this very moment still entirely unaware of how close tonight had come to ending everything for all 3 of them simultaneously. By morning, they would know. By morning, the operation would either still be alive in its current form or it wouldn't, and either way she had done everything within her power, every ounce of training and discipline she possessed, to protect it for as long as humanly possible. She thought, too, of the 11 months stretching backward behind her, the holidays spent alone in motel rooms because going home risked exposure, the relationships she'd let go quiet, rather than explain the version of her own life that had simply paused, waiting for her to come back to it whenever this ended. Tonight had nearly ended it the wrong way. Tomorrow it would end the right way instead, and she intended to let herself feel the difference, eventually, once there was time and space enough to feel anything at all beyond the immediate work in front of her. By the time the sun fully cleared the horizon, the lot had returned to something resembling its ordinary rhythm. Most of the crowd had dispersed, returning to their own routes and schedules, though more than a few lingered to exchange phone numbers and footage with each other, a loose, improvised network of witnesses forming in real time around what they'd all just seen together. Ford's team finished their initial documentation and prepared to move the operation's next phase forward. The dawn convergence Maya had spent months preparing for, now proceeding slightly delayed but otherwise intact, exactly 4 hours behind schedule and infinitely more fragile than it should have been. The young woman who had been live streaming approached Maya briefly before leaving, hesitant in a way she hadn't been all night. "I just wanted to say I'm glad I kept recording. I almost stopped a couple times because I felt weird about it, but I'm glad I didn't." Maya thanked her, meant it, and watched her walk back toward her car, still looking faintly stunned by what she'd been part of, the particular disorientation of an ordinary night turning, without warning, into something she'd likely remember for the rest of her life. A week after the incident, Maya learned through a brief note forwarded by Ford's office that the canine handler who'd run the dog twice around her trailer that night had filed his own supplementary statement unprompted, confirming in writing that no alert had occurred, and that he'd told Hutchins as much clearly twice before being asked to stand down from the scene entirely. It was a small detail in the larger case file, the kind of footnote most people would skim past without a second thought. But Maya read it twice, struck by the quiet, unglamorous decency of a man doing his job honestly, in a moment when it would have been far easier to simply nod along with whatever the senior officer on scene wanted to hear. She thought, not for the first time since that night, that the case had ultimately been carried not by any single dramatic intervention, but by a series of ordinary people choosing independently and without coordination to tell the truth when it would have cost them nothing to stay quiet instead. 3 weeks later, in a conference room back at the Omaha field office, Maya sat across from her supervisor, reviewing the final case file, the photographs of warehouses and seized shipments spread across the table between them, like the closing chapter of a book she'd spent nearly a year writing line by careful line. Reyes and Okafor had both made it out clean, their covers intact, through to the final arrests. The morning convergence proceeding exactly as planned, once Maya's truck rolled westbound at dawn, carrying the notebook that tied the whole operation together. 11 arrests across 3 states. A supply chain responsible for tracking back to at least 14 confirmed overdose deaths, with investigators still working to determine how many more the network's full reach extended to before it was finally dismantled. None of it would carry her name in any public report, exactly as the job required, exactly as she'd always understood the work to be when she signed on for it years earlier. "You held the line," her supervisor said, simply closing the file. "Closer than I'd like, but you held it." "I keep thinking about the dog," Maya said somewhat unexpectedly after a moment. 2 clean sweeps, no alert, and he still opened that latch. If that handler hadn't put it in writing the way he did on his own, without anyone asking him to, I wonder how differently the whole report might have read, how differently the whole night might have ended. "That's the thing about cases like this," her supervisor said. "They never come down to just the one moment everybody remembers afterward. They come down to 4 or 5 ordinary people choosing independently not to lie. Take any one of them out, and the story looks completely different." "I had help," Maya said. "A trucker who'd been collecting evidence on his own for over a year because nobody official ever asked him to. A sergeant who told the truth even when it was inconvenient. A rookie who's going to be a better officer because of one bad night." She paused. "Tell Ford I said that part matters too, not just the arrests." Her supervisor studied her for a moment, something thoughtful crossing his expression. "You've been doing this a long time, Devereaux. 11 years now, isn't it? You ever think about what comes after the next one?" "Every assignment I tell myself I'll think about it once this one's over," Maya said. 11 years and I still haven't gotten around to actually doing it." "Maybe this is the one where you finally do," he said, not pushing the point further, and Maya let the suggestion sit there without answering it, directly the way she'd learned to let a lot of things sit unanswered until she was ready. 2 days after the incident itself, in plain clothes, driving a borrowed sedan, instead of the rig she'd spent 11 months calling home, Maya had returned to the Crossroads Travel Plaza one final time before the case fully closed. The pipeline that had moved poison through quiet American towns for longer than anyone in the public wanted to fully admit had finally been dismantled piece by piece, warehouse by warehouse. The small handwritten notebook she'd carried for months, becoming in the end the single thread that had unraveled the entire operation faster than anyone on the task force had dared hope. The interstate stretched out ahead of her, ordinary and indifferent. The same road she'd driven 100 times in the persona of a woman who never existed. It felt strange now, the absence of that persona, like setting down a weight she'd carried so long she'd half forgotten it had a name. She found Earl Whitfield at a picnic table near the edge of the lot, exactly where she'd hoped he might still be, nursing a cup of coffee against the morning chill, with both hands wrapped around the cup, the way people do when the warmth matters more than the drink itself. He looked up as she approached, recognition taking a moment longer than usual to register without the truck and the persona that had gone along with it for so many months. "Didn't expect to see you out of uniform," he said, gesturing for her to sit across from him. "Didn't expect to be able to tell you any of this in person," Maya said, lowering herself onto the bench across from him, grateful for the ordinary solidness of the wood beneath her after everything that had happened in this same lot 2 nights earlier. "But I wanted to. You earned that much at least, after everything you did without anybody asking you to." She told him what she could not. The classified details, not the names that still needed protecting for their own safety, but enough to give the shape of it enough for him to understand what he'd actually witnessed and what role he'd played in how it ended. 11 months undercover, longer than any single assignment should reasonably run. A multi-state operation that had quietly ended a supply chain responsible for more deaths than the public would likely ever fully know or properly count. A badge that had stayed hidden in a duffel bag for nearly a year, waiting patiently for exactly the wrong night to finally come back out into the light. Earl listened without interrupting, the same way he'd listened to everything else that happened 2 nights ago, and when she finished, he just shook his head, slowly processing it, the way he seemed to process most things in life, carefully, without rushing toward easy or comfortable conclusions. "All that time," he said, sitting right here in this lot week after week probably, and I had no idea. None of us did. That was the entire point, Maya said. Best disguise there is in this line of work. Ordinary, forgettable, exactly what nobody looks twice at. Heard Hutchins got terminated, Earl said. Formal, not just suspended pending review, like these things usually go. And there's talk of federal charges sitting on top of it now. There is, Maya confirmed. Civil rights violation, obstruction of a federal investigation. It's moving through the right channels now, slower than any of us would like, but moving. And the Sergeant Bannerman, formal reprimand in his file. He should have stopped it sooner than he did, and the record's going to reflect exactly that for as long as he's on the force. But he also told the truth when it mattered most on the record, in front of witnesses instead of closing ranks, the way it would have been easier to do. That counts for something in my book, even if it's nowhere close to everything. Earl nodded slowly, turning his coffee cup a quarter turn on the table without quite looking at it. World's a strange place, he said eventually. Man does the right thing late and still gets some credit for doing it at all. Another man does the wrong thing for years, running and finally gets caught because one tired old trucker happened to keep his dash cam running on the right night. The footage mattered more than you probably realize, Maya said. It corroborated everything that ended up in the federal report, gave it weight it might not have had otherwise. Without it, this whole thing might have taken months longer to resolve properly, if it resolved at all the way it should have. Glad it was good for something besides making me feel less crazy all these months, Earl said, and something in his voice carried real weight beneath the dry humor. The accumulated frustration of more than a year finally finding somewhere useful and concrete to land. Wished I'd done something with it sooner, honestly. Maybe could have spared somebody else a bad night before yours ever happened. You did something with it exactly when it mattered most, Maya said. That's not nothing, Earl. That's not nothing at all. They sat together for a while longer after that, not saying much of anything more. The morning traffic moving steadily along the interstate beyond the lot. Ordinary and entirely indifferent to everything that had happened here 2 nights earlier in the dark. A waitress from the diner brought out a second cup of coffee without being asked, setting it down in front of Maya with a small, knowing nod, before walking away again as if she understood, in some unspoken way, that this particular morning deserved a small kindness. Eventually, Maya stood, knowing she had a debriefing waiting back in Omaha, a real life waiting for her to step back into after 11 months of being someone else entirely, someone who had never really existed at all outside the careful architecture of an assignment. Take care of yourself, Earl. You too, Agent Devereaux. He said her real name carefully, almost experimentally, like he was still getting used to the actual shape and weight of it, after only ever knowing the other one. Hope the next assignment's a little less eventful than this one turned out to be. They usually aren't, she said, and for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, she let herself smile without calculating what the smile needed to communicate to anyone watching her do it. Driving away from the Crossroads Travel Plaza, for the last time the early sun breaking gold across the wide Nebraska plains in every direction, Maya thought about the badge that had spent 11 months hidden in a duffel bag, waiting patiently in the dark for its moment. It had never really been the badge that mattered most, not in any way that counted. It had been the 11 months of discipline underneath it, the patience required to stay invisible long enough to see something larger through to its proper end. The truth that had been there all along, waiting quietly in the dark for the right moment to finally surface into the light where everyone could see it clearly. The badge was just the proof, the final formality. The truth itself had always been the work, and the work finally was done. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved us to put it together and bring it to you, we'd be grateful if you hit that like button, shared it with somebody who needs the reminder that patience and truth still win out in the end, even when it takes longer than anyone would like, and subscribe our channel so you never miss the next one when it drops on this channel. Thank you so much for watching this story all the way through with us tonight. Stories like Maya's matter to us deeply, not because they're easy or comfortable to tell, but because they remind us that dignity and truth have a way of surfacing eventually, no matter how long the wait or how dark the night gets before morning. We're grateful for every single one of you who stays with us until the very end. See you in the next one.